Widowed rancher noticed the girl cooking in his kitchen was crying. What he did next changed her life forever. Wyoming Territory, late October 1877. The wind carried the first bite of winter through the open plains, rattling the dry grass like bones whispering beneath the soil. Jacob Rourke's ranch sat a few miles south of Laramie, tucked in a narrow valley between ridges that turned red under the evening sun. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and the silence inside his home stretched longer than either. Jacob stepped through the front door, the scent of warm broth curling through the air. "I did not ask you to put onions in," he said flatly. No response. He narrowed his eyes and walked toward the stove. The girl, Clara, stood still as stone, her back to him, wooden spoon trembling in her hand. Her shoulders quivered ever so slightly. Then he saw it. A tear rolled off her cheek, dropping soundlessly into the pot of soup. Jacob stopped in his tracks. "Are you crying?" Clara turned her head a fraction, startled. She quickly wiped her face with her sleeve, then shook her head once. She did not speak. She never did. Jacob exhaled through his nose, more confused than annoyed. "I do not care much for onions," he muttered, softer now. Clara gave a small nod and stirred the pot again. He lingered a moment longer, then stepped back. "Dinner in 10, he said, though he was not hungry. He left her there with the spoon, the steam, and whatever sorrow was spilling over with each stir. He sat at the table, staring out the window as dusk melted into shadow. Coyotes were beginning their night song somewhere past the barn. He listened, letting the ache in his chest settle. It had been 4 years since he buried Abigail on a hill overlooking the pasture. 4 winters, 4 birthdays, 4 times hearing her name in dreams, only to wake with fists clenched and bed sheets cold. He had not asked for the girl, but Pastor Monroe from the church in Laramie had asked him to take her in, just until spring. She had nowhere else to go. The pastor's voice had been low, careful. "She is quiet, Jacob. Gentle. She will not be a burden." Clara had arrived 2 weeks ago, with a satchel no bigger than a flour sack and a stitched cross on the hem of her dress. She cooked well, cleaned better, and did not speak. He assumed she was mute, though no one had said it outright. She had not smiled once. That night, supper was quiet as always. Jacob spooned the broth in silence, while Clara sat across from him, her eyes lowered. The onions were soft, sweet, subtle, just like her. He wanted to say it was good. He did not. Afterward, she cleared the table, and he returned to his chair by the fire, the old one Abigail had chosen from the wagon shop in Cheyenne. He watched the flames rise and fall, letting their flicker blur the edges of the room. He heard the soft clink of the wash basin in the kitchen, then the creak of the floorboards as Clara retreated to the small back room that once stored seed and grain. Hours passed. Jacob sat alone. Before heading to bed, he walked through the kitchen to check the fire in the stove. It had died down, but the warmth lingered in the air. That was when he saw it, tucked just under the table leg, a small white cloth. He bent down and picked it up. Handkerchief, worn thin, the initials CH, stitched in red thread, damp. Jacob turned it over in his hand. There were tear stains across the center, fresh ones. He stood still for a moment, hand clenched around the fabric. The wind howled outside, scraping against the window pane like some lost creature. Something about that cloth, those silent tears. He felt it settle in his bones like winter itself. This was no ordinary sadness, no momentary homesickness. There was a weight to her grief, a story she was not telling, maybe could not tell. He placed the cloth gently on the table, beside the salt tin. Then he turned off the kitchen lamp, the flame flickering once before darkness returned. In the silence, Jacob Rourke realized something. The girl in his kitchen was not just quiet. She was hiding. From something or someone. And now, whatever it was part of his home. He stared down the hallway toward the closed door of the back room. "I do not like onions," he whispered again, but he would eat every bowl of her soup. The fire cracked low in the hearth. Jacob sat in his old chair, boots off, legs stretched toward the fading glow. A half-empty glass of rye rested on the floorboards beside him. Outside, wind whispered against the windows, threading through the eaves like a ghost looking for a door left open. The house was warm, but his chest felt hollow. He closed his eyes, and the memory came. It was December, 4 winters ago. The snow had fallen for 3 days straight, relentless, furious, piling high against the walls of the barn until the doors froze shut. Abigail had coughed through the night, a sound sharp enough to cut through wood. He had wrapped her in every blanket they owned, boiled water for steam, and rubbed her back until his hands ached. "I will get the doctor," he had promised. But the wind had other plans. By morning, the snowdrift reached the windows. His horse had gone lame the week before, and the trail to town was buried beneath 5 feet of white silence. He waited, helpless, as her breaths grew thinner, shorter, like the flicker of a candle before it dies. She died with her hand in his, whispering something he could not understand. He buried her 2 days later on the ridge above the east pasture, where wildflowers bloomed in spring. Alone, just him, a frozen shovel, and the sound of snow still falling. After that, Jacob stopped going into town unless he needed supplies. He stopped answering letters, stopped fixing the porch rail, the laughter that once filled the kitchen, the music that danced through the house in summer, all of it faded into dust and silence. He worked the ranch like a man digging his own grave, slow, steady, with no end in sight. The cattle did not mind his silence. The land did not care if he smiled. For 4 years he had lived this way, until the girl arrived. He looked toward the back room where Clara slept. The door was closed, a sliver of lamplight sneaking out beneath it. She had barely spoken a word, only gestures, glances, and those rare scribbles on a torn page when necessary. But in her quiet, Jacob heard echoes of himself, a grief that did not scream, a sorrow too deep for sound. She moved through the house like a shadow, never drawing attention, never asking for more than what was given. But her eyes, those eyes carried storms. He remembered the way her shoulders had trembled at the stove, the silent tears falling into soup. He took a long breath. Abigail had been all warmth and laughter. Clara was different, fragile but not broken, young but old in ways that had nothing to do with years. She reminded him of snow, beautiful, cold, and unpredictable. Jacob reached down and picked up the handkerchief again, still faintly damp. He turned it in his hands, thumb brushing over the red-threaded initials. It felt too intimate to hold, but too painful to let go. He whispered, almost to the fire, "You are not the only one trying to forget." The flames snapped gently in response. He poured the rest of the rye into his glass and stared into the glow. In the firelight, he saw Clara's face again, framed by steam, eyes glossy with unspoken ache. He saw Abigail's last breath. He saw his own hands, raw from shoveling frozen earth. He realized something. He and Clara, 2 people bound by silence, wrapped in layers of things left unsaid, survivors, not of war or violence, but of a quiet, cruel kind of loneliness. He leaned back in the chair, head tilted toward the ceiling. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time they both started living again. The next morning, the frost clung to the windows like lace made of ice. Jacob stirred his coffee slowly, watching the steam rise and disappear. Clara was already in the kitchen, her steps light, precise. She moved like someone who had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. He cleared his throat. "Clara." She paused, spoon in hand, and turned toward him. Her eyes met his briefly, then dropped. "I need to ask you something," Jacob said, voice even. "Do you not speak because you cannot or because you will not?" Clara looked down at her hands. Her fingers clenched slightly, then relaxed. Jacob waited, patient but firm. Finally she walked to the table, picked up the small notepad that lay beside the salt jar, and tore off a page. Her handwriting was awkward, slanted, the letters uneven. "I do not speak any more." Jacob frowned slightly. He pointed to the word anymore. So, you used to. She nodded. Another pause. Then she scribbled again. Since I was 15. It stopped. His eyes narrowed. He did not press. Something about the way she gripped the pencil said this was hard, painful. Did something happen? He asked gently. Clara hesitated, her lips pressed tight, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote. Home. Foster. He hit. He... The pencil stopped moving. She did not finish the word. Jacob's jaw tightened. He reached across the table and gently took the pencil from her hand, setting it aside. Clara did not pull away, but her shoulders stiffened, eyes shimmering. Clara, he said softly, you do not have to tell me more, not unless you want to. She looked up. Their eyes locked for the first time, not in passing, not through routine, but deeply. Her gaze was raw, honest, filled with things she had no voice to say. He leaned back in his chair, sighed. I do not know much about healing, he said, but I know silence can be as loud as a gunshot. Clara's fingers curled slightly in her lap. He noticed a small scar near her wrist, faded but visible. Another story untold. I lost someone too, he added. My wife. She was the only light in this house. After she passed, the world got very quiet. Clara blinked. Jacob stood slowly and walked to the window. You are not broken. Whatever that man did to you, he does not get to have your silence too. She stared at his back, unmoving. Then he turned to her again. His voice steadied, not demanding but resolute. Here, you do not have to speak, just live. Just live. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Something in her chest cracked, like a thaw. Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears were softer, warmer. She reached for the pencil one more time. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. Thank you. That was all, but it was enough. Jacob gave a faint nod. I will be outside, checking the fence line. The cows like to wander this time of year. As he stepped toward the door, he stopped beside her and gently tapped the page. You ever feel like saying more? I will listen. You do not owe me a word, but I will hear every one you give. Then he walked out, boots thudding on the porch boards, the cold air swallowing him. Inside, Clara sat still. Her heart pounded like hooves in a canyon. She picked up the notepad again, stared at the empty page. For the first time in years, she began to write, not out of fear or confession, but out of a fragile hope that someone, finally, would read her without judgment. And outside, Jacob paused at the edge of the corral, looking back at the window. He thought he saw a glow behind the glass, not from the stove, but from her. The snow came early that year, coating the earth in silence. The trees around the ranch wore frost like old lace, and the horses puffed steam into the morning like restless spirits. Inside the house was warm, not because of fire alone, but because something was beginning to shift between its two quiet occupants. Jacob found Clara at the table that morning, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The pencil lay untouched beside it. Writing again? He asked gently. Clara shook her head. He set down the bucket of kindling he had carried in and sat across from her. Words can be strange things, he said. Hard to find when they matter most. Easy to throw away when they should be held onto. Clara tilted her head, curious. He tapped the page with one calloused finger. Have you ever tried writing a letter, not to anyone in particular, just out, like putting thoughts into a bottle and tossing it downstream? She hesitated, then picked up the pencil. Jacob stood and left her to it. By midday she was still there, hunched over the table, lips pressed together in deep thought. When Jacob returned from chopping wood, she was gone, but the page remained. He paused at the doorway, unsure if he should look. He did. Dear Mama, it began, I dreamed of your soup last night, the one with barley and rosemary. I think I tried to make it last week, but I cried into the pot. I hope that does not ruin the taste. I remember your hands. They were warm. He said I would forget you, but I never did. I still dream of your voice. Jacob exhaled slowly. His eyes scanned the rest of the page, words about the cellar she had been locked in once, about the bruises no one asked about the fear of footsteps in the hallway, about how the silence had once been safety, but now felt like a cage. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. Then he stepped outside, walked to the edge of the porch where the snow had begun to melt under the weak sun, and knelt beside the planter box. Last summer, Abigail's daisies had bloomed there. Among them, white wild chrysanthemums, her favorite. He searched until he found what he wanted, a single dried bloom, fragile but intact. He returned to the kitchen and tucked the flower into the crease of Clara's letter. That evening she found it. She did not say anything, she never did, but Jacob watched from across the room as she picked up the folded page, opened it, and saw the flower fall gently into her lap. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her breath shallow. Then she began to cry. Not the silent, trembling kind he had seen before. This time it came in waves, quiet sobs that shook her shoulders, that soaked her collar. She pressed the flower to her chest like something sacred, something remembered. Jacob did not move. He sat still, letting her have that moment, letting her be undone, alone but not abandoned. Later, as the fire dimmed and the stars gathered outside like watchers in the dark, Clara placed the letter, now with the flower folded inside, into a small box on the mantel. Next to it she placed a smooth stone, a piece of string, and the old handkerchief Jacob had returned days ago. A collection of things that meant nothing to the world, and everything to her. Jacob watched the way she touched each item, the care in her movement, the reverence. It stirred something in him. Not desire, not yet, but a kind of aching admiration. He realized he wanted to protect her, not out of duty, but because her presence had filled a space he thought would always stay empty. Love, he thought, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was a dried flower tucked into a folded page. And sometimes it was enough. The days grew longer, bit by bit. Winter clung to the edges of the land, but the light in the mornings stretched farther than before. On one such morning, Jacob found Clara hunched over the kitchen counter, hands covered in flour. "You trying to poison me?" he teased gently. Clara turned, eyes wide with mock offense. She held up her hands in surrender, white as snow. Jacob chuckled. "Smells like bread," he said, surprised. She nodded, then pointed to an old cookbook resting on the table, its pages yellowed and edges curled. He recognized it immediately. Abigail's. He walked over slowly, eyes settling on the bookmarked page. Sweet milk bread for winter mornings. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Clara motioned toward the back cabinet where the recipe books had been gathering dust for years. Jacob stared at the ingredients list. Abigail used to make that bread every Sunday morning, humming while the dough rose near the hearth. The scent alone used to draw him from bed. Clara reached for a small piece of parchment and scribbled. She wrote notes in the margins. I like how she spelled sugar with a backwards S. Jacob smiled faintly. She used to rush everything, always skipped steps, but somehow the bread never failed. Clara offered him a piece of raw dough. He wrinkled his nose. "I trust your baking, not your sense of humor." Over the following days, their routine changed. Mornings were no longer weighed down by silence, but filled with the quiet thump of dough against the counter, the crackling of kindling catching flame, the hum of wind slipping past the window. Clara laughed once, not out loud, but with her shoulders, with her eyes, and Jacob caught it like sunlight on snow. She began leaving small notes around the house. "The birds are back. You snore less when you sleep by the fire. I like this place in spring. I think I want to stay." Each one made Jacob pause longer than he meant to. He found himself looking forward to them, rereading them by lantern light. One evening, after supper, he found a folded paper tucked under his plate. "I am not afraid anymore." Just that. Nothing more. He stared at the words for a long while. Then, without thinking, he folded it back and placed it carefully in his breast pocket. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the sky like the world splitting open. Rain pelted the roof in angry bursts. Jacob stirred awake to a sound, low, broken, a sob. He rose from his bed and padded toward the back room. The door was ajar. Clara was curled in the corner of her cot, clutching the blanket, her whole body shaking. "Clara," he whispered. She did not move. He crouched beside her, slowly reaching out. "Clara," he said again, gently. "It is me. You are safe." She blinked, eyes wide with fear. "I will not touch you unless you want me to, but you are not alone." Her lip trembled. Then, slowly, she nodded once. Jacob opened his arms, not as a demand, but as an offering. She leaned forward, hesitating only a second before falling into him. Her body shook against his chest, but she did not flinch. His arms wrapped around her, firm and steady. For the first time she let herself be held. They stayed like that until the thunder passed, until the wind softened. And in that stillness, Jacob knew. He was no longer holding a frightened girl. He was holding the beginning of something whole. The knock came just after noon, hard and sharp, echoing through the stillness of the house. Jacob stood from the table, brows furrowed. Clara froze mid-step, a bowl of peeled apples in her hands. He opened the door. A tall man stood on the porch, dark coat dusted with road dirt, hat pulled low over a long, narrow face. He tipped the brim, revealing sharp blue eyes and a grin that never reached them. A collection of several books. "Jacob Rourke." "I am," Jacob answered, guarded. The man extended a folded document. "Name's Emery Haskett. I come from Topeka, Clara Harwood's kin. Her mother was my cousin. I've come to take her home." Jacob did not take the paper. "She has not mentioned you." "She would not," Haskett said with a half shrug. "Family fell apart after her ma died. Girl got passed around some, but I filed with the county and have full custody. That's the law." Jacob turned to glance at Clara. She stood behind him in the hallway, pale as paper, the bowl trembling in her hands. He took the document and scanned it. The signature bore the seal of Shawnee County, legal, official. But his gut turned cold. "She is under my care," Jacob said. "The church sent her." Haskett nodded. "That was temporary. Charity's fine and well, but blood takes priority." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Why now? Why after all this time?" Haskett's smile thinned. "Does it matter?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. The man's tone sharpened. "You do not have a claim here, mister. I do, and I will have her ready by morning." He turned, stepped off the porch, and strode back to his wagon hitched near the edge of the property. Jacob shut the door and turned slowly. Clara was shaking. "Clara," he said softly, "you know him?" She nodded once, then scribbled furiously on the notepad she now carried with her always. "He was my foster uncle, last home before Kansas, sent me to the church. He said he had rights, but he hurt me." Jacob's jaw clenched. He took the paper and read it twice. "I will not let him take you." Clara wrote again, faster now. "He was investigated once. A neighbor saw bruises, but they dropped the charges. No one believed me." Jacob stood there a long moment, torn between fury and helplessness. He had spent his life following rules. He had never struck a man without cause, but now every fiber in his body wanted to storm out and beat Emery Haskett into the dirt. Instead, he saddled his horse and rode to the sheriff's office in Laramie, showed them the letter, asked questions, demanded answers. The sheriff, an old friend of Abigail's, looked grim. "Jacob, I believe you. Hell, I do not trust that man's eyes, but the papers are clean. Unless you want to get arrested yourself, there ain't a damn thing I can do." "You would really let her go back to that?" Jacob said through clenched teeth. The sheriff sighed. "My hands are tied. State law's clear." Jacob rode home, stomach knotted. That night he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded tightly, lips pressed into a thin line. She had not touched her supper. "I tried," he said. "The law does not care what I know, only what it sees on paper." She nodded. Then, slowly, she picked up her pencil and wrote just 2 words. "I know." Later, as they packed her small satchel in silence, Clara moved like a ghost. Jacob wanted to scream, to tear the document, to send the man back to hell where he belonged. But he could not. At dawn, the wagon creaked near the fence line. Clara stood at the door, hat in her hand, face turned to stone. Jacob knelt beside her. "You do not have to speak," he whispered. "But if you want to stay, I will fight for you, no matter the cost." Clara did not move. Haskett called from outside, voice like gravel. "Let's go, girl." Clara stepped forward. She turned to Jacob once, eyes brimming, and bit her lip so hard it bled. Then she climbed into the wagon. Jacob stood in the doorway long after the dust had settled. Inside his fist, crumpled and torn from her notebook, was one word she had left on the kitchen table. "Oh." The days after Clara's departure moved slowly, like cold molasses over stone. Jacob went through the motions, feeding the horses, checking the fence, boiling coffee that tasted like ash. The kitchen was quiet again, not in peace but in absence. Her apron still hung on the wall. The flour jar sat unopened. The house had returned to its old silence, but now it rang hollow, cruel. He had not slept a full night since she left. The letter he had slipped into her satchel was short, folded twice, written with fingers that shook. "If you want to come back, just walk toward the kitchen light. I will leave it on every night." He placed a lamp in the window over the sink and lit it at sundown, every evening, a flicker of hope burning through storm, distance, and fear. A week passed. Then came the storm. Thunder cracked the sky open like a whip. Rain pelted the roof in angry bursts. Jacob sat by the fire, boots unlaced, listening. A knock. Not loud, but frantic. He froze. Rising slowly, he stepped to the door, heart hammering. Outside, soaked to the bone, barefoot and shaking, stood Clara. Her dress clung to her frame, torn and filthy. One cheek was bruised, purple and swollen. Her hair plastered to her face, her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding in the last of her strength. Jacob did not say a word. He stepped aside. She crossed the threshold. Mud and water soaked into the floorboards as she stumbled inside. He knelt before her, slowly, reverently, and took her feet in his hands. Without a word, he reached for the old linen cloth, the one Abigail had once embroidered with blue thread. He dipped it in warm water, wrung it gently, and began to wash Clara's feet. She stared down at him, eyes glassy. He did not speak, did not ask, did not press. He simply washed. When he finished, he dried her feet with a clean towel, stood, and gently wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Then, only then, did he reach for her. She fell into his arms without resistance. Jacob held her close, not as a savior, not as a protector, but as a man who had waited every night for the impossible and now could not believe it had returned to him. He felt her trembling begin to ease. They stood there in the soft flicker of the kitchen lamp, the storm fading outside, and in that moment he held her like the world would end if he let go. Later he made her tea, wrapped her hands around the warm cup, and sat beside her until her breath steadied. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. The silence was different now. He made a bed for her by the fire. She slept without a nightmare. Morning came, slow, soft, silver. The storm had passed. Jacob stirred from his chair to find Clara already in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing one of his flannel shirts that hung nearly to her knees. She was cutting apples, the old cookbook open beside her. He stepped beside her, unsure what to say. She turned to him, took his hand gently, and with the other, traced one word into his palm. Home. He looked up at her. She smiled, just a little, but it was the kind of smile that could raise the dead. Winter passed softly that year, like a page turned by wind. The snow melted without fanfare, leaving behind green sheets in the soil and a quiet hum of life. In the little ranch, tucked between ridges, the house breathed again. Jacob and Clara found their rhythm, not in grand moments, but in small, honest ones. He taught her to saddle a horse, how to read the sky for rain, and how to plant seeds deep enough to survive the wind. She, in turn, taught him how to listen, not just with ears, but with his eyes, his hands, and his heart. She laughed once, real and out loud, when he fell off a mule trying to impress her. He wore the bruise for a week and the smile for longer. Clara began keeping a journal. At first, just a few lines a day. Then pages, recipes, memories, dreams. She never let him read them, until one morning she slid a folded page across the breakfast table. He opened it, expecting another shopping list or note about eggs. Instead, he read, "I cannot speak, but my heart has been calling your name since the first day I cried in your soup." Jacob stared at the page, then looked at her. She blushed, eyes dropping, but she did not take the page back. That afternoon he disappeared into the barn for hours. When he returned, he held a piece of sanded pine, smooth and warm to the touch. On it, carved with his pocket knife, were 6 simple words. "Stay, Clara, not as a guest, as my wife." He said nothing, just handed it to her. Clara pressed the wood to her chest. Her tears came quietly, falling like petals. Then she nodded. They married a week later. The ceremony was small, just the pastor from Laramie, a few neighbors, and the spring sun casting gold through the chapel windows. Jacob wore his cleanest shirt. Clara wore a dress stitched from linen and lace she had found in Abigail's old trunk. There were no traditional vows. Instead, Jacob unfolded a letter he had written by firelight the night before. "I once believed love ended with silence, that grief made a man whole in its own way, but then you came and taught me that silence can speak, grief can mend, and soup, well, soup can save a life." Clara responded with a folded paper of her own, tucked inside a small linen envelope. "I cannot promise I will always smile, but I promise I will never leave the kitchen without waiting for you to sit beside me." They signed their names in the ledger, side by side. Later that spring, Clara opened a cooking class for children from the orphanage in Laramie. Jacob built her a wide wooden table by hand, big enough for 10 small hands and twice as many bowls. She taught them how to slice onions without crying, how to stir with their whole heart, and how to taste before serving. Jacob planted a greenhouse beside the barn, lettuce, tomatoes, herbs. They called it Clara's garden, though she joked it should be Jacob's backache. In the kitchen, above the stove, hung a piece of embroidered linen framed in wood. Stitched in simple, careful letters were the words, "Where words failed, soup healed." And beneath it, pinned to the edge, was a dried white daisy. And so, in a quiet valley where grief once lived and snow once fell without end, a woman who had no voice found a home, and a man who had lost everything found a reason to believe again. They never needed many words. Just warmth, just presence, just love, served one bowl at a time. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every week we bring you powerful tales of love, loss, and redemption from the rugged heart of the American frontier, where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment that might just stay with you forever.